Hi everyone, my name is Claire Fyson. I'm a policy analyst at Climate Analytics, and I'll be talking to you today about governance gaps relating to large-scale carbon dioxide removal and how we might address them. This builds on a report that was published in 2018 by myself, MJ Mace, Bill Hare and Michiel Schäfer, and watch this space for an update of the report, which we're currently working on, so check out our website for more information. I'm going to start briefly with why we need to talk about carbon dioxide removal, or CDR. We know that all mitigation pathways that are compatible with the Paris Agreement's temperature limit of 1.5 degrees require some level of carbon dioxide removal. This is because even with our best efforts, some emissions, for example from agriculture, cannot be fully phased out. But we also need to make up for years of delayed action to reduce emissions. We've just been too slow. But this need for carbon dioxide removal does not in any way replace or allow for any delay in mitigation actions. Emissions need to drop rapidly in the next few decades. Carbon dioxide needs to reach net zero by mid-century, so in 3 decades' time, and the whole basket of greenhouse gas emissions needs to reach net zero by around 2070. So we've got a steep curve to follow. Now, reaching this milestone will require urgent emission reductions in all sectors, but it will also require a ramping up of carbon removal from both the land sector, but also from the introduction of other carbon dioxide removal options. Now, importantly, the scale of carbon dioxide removal and the mix of measures that we will ultimately need depends on the pace of greenhouse gas reductions that we achieve in the next decade or two. The faster that we reduce emissions, the less we will have to depend on carbon removal. And that's important because the reality is that large-scale carbon dioxide removal is not currently available at the scale that we would need it at. Many options are untested, and a lot of options become increasingly problematic at scale. So, for example, they lead to problems of land availability, water availability, energy consumption, or problematic social, environmental, and economic consequences. And these can ultimately clash with our sustainable development objectives. So, carbon dioxide removal is by no means a magic bullet, and every effort should be made to reduce our reliance on it. And how do we do this? Well, it's clear that our ambition over the next decade is really key. If you look at this graph, you can see on the x-axis we see emissions levels in 2030, and the orange bar on the right-hand side shows where we're heading, where the aggregate effect of countries' pledges under the Paris Agreement would take us to. That's to about 3 degrees of warming. And then on the left-hand side, in contrast, the blue bar shows where our 2030 emissions would need to be in order to limit warming to 1.5. And then we can see 4 illustrative pathways given by the circles. So 3 of them, the ones in blue, they're compatible with the Paris Agreement, so they limit warming to around 1.5 degrees, whereas the red circle shows a pathway that is actually not compatible with the Paris Agreement because it overshoots 1.5 degrees by a high degree. Now, you can see from these pathways that there is a clear relationship between ambition in 2030, so that's given on the x-axis, and the amount of carbon dioxide removal that we'll need over the century, that's given on the y-axis. It's also clear that the amount of ambition in the near term affects the mix of carbon dioxide removal options that we might need. So it's noted here on the graph how much bioenergy with carbon capture and storage each of these pathways uses. And the lower our ambition is in 2030, the more we'll be reliant on these technological carbon dioxide removal options, which are much more uncertain. Now, the need for carbon dioxide removal to meet the 1.5 degree temperature limit raises a lot of important governance questions. Let's take a look at some of these. What governance tools need to be put in place if large-scale carbon dioxide removal is needed? Can the provisions under the current climate regime support implementation at scale? Who should be responsible for undertaking carbon removal in an equitable world? Are we able to keep track of carbon dioxide removal implementation? Can we account for it? And how do we avoid conflating carbon removal with needed mitigation measures? Finally, how do we recognise and stay within sustainable development constraints? So we have lots of questions. Well, let's take a quick look at what governance architecture we currently have in place for carbon removal. Global governance for CDR lies primarily within the climate change regime under the UNFCCC, so that's the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The climate change regime provides us with an agreed global goal of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. And that's really important because from that we can derive the scale of emissions reductions that need to take place and the time frame over which they need to happen. And that also tells us how much carbon removal we will need. We also have 3 treaties within this regime, and there are supporting decisions from those treaties that we can learn from and build on that are relevant for carbon removal. Some brief examples. The convention, the UNFCCC, This contains an obligation not only to mitigate emissions, but also to enhance removals. And it includes provisions for countries to report their greenhouse gas emissions and removals so that we can all see where we're at. Then we have the Kyoto Protocol. This has a lot of lessons to be learned around land sector accounting, so that's relevant for terrestrial removals. And in particular, it looks at issues relating to the permanence of carbon removals and risks of leakage, so a removal happening in one place causing an emission somewhere else. And then we have the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement has important architecture for countries to set their own mitigation targets. We have a unified transparency framework for reporting progress against those targets. And then we have a global stocktake for tracking progress at the global level against the Paris Agreement's goal of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees and its other goals. And then finally, we have requirements for the use of market mechanisms. So if parties wish to transfer mitigation outcomes, which may include removals between each other, then they will have to follow these requirements. In addition, we have some supporting guidance from the IPCC, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And this is relevant for how parties report their removals that they achieve either through the land sector, but also through, for example, bioenergy with CCS or direct air capture with carbon capture and storage. And finally, we have a suite of IPCC products that assess the latest science related to carbon removal. So, for example, the recent special report on climate change in land provides us with a clear understanding of the potential role that the land sector can play in meeting Paris Agreement goals, and this includes carbon removal. But plenty of governance gaps remain. Of course, we have a mitigation gap. We're just not doing enough to reduce our emissions. We also have information gaps, accounting gaps, knowledge gaps, and incentive gaps. And then there are both political and scientific governance challenges to closing these gaps. So let's go into a little more detail. On the political front, although we know that current NDCs are insufficient, the Paris Agreement does not set a minimum ambition level for individual parties. So that makes it very difficult to raise ambition. At the international level, ambition is really dependent on peer pressure. And that obviously depends on domestic political contexts and on capacities. And we know that that has limited effectiveness in some contexts. Similarly, responsibility for carbon removal amongst countries hasn't actually been addressed under the climate change regime. So different parties might have different views on how the burden of carbon removal that's there at the global level might be shared between countries when equity considerations are taken into account. It's also important to remember that the Paris Agreement and its rule set is the product of a negotiation process. So these products aren't perfect. Parties weren't able to agree on detailed rules for the presentation of their mitigation pledges before the pledges were submitted in 2015. And as a result, these NDCs take a range of different forms and they're widely differing ambition levels, which makes it difficult to compare them. Now, we do actually have some rules since the Paris Agreement came into force. We have a rule book with some rules for how to formulate NDCs, but they're quite limited in their detail. As I said, there's no minimum ambition specified. We haven't yet agreed to a common time frame for the NDCs, so countries can have targets with different time frames, which makes it very difficult to compare them. Not all NDCs are economy-wide, so that means some NDCs leave out sectors, including the land sector, for example, or they might leave out gases. And those NDCs that do include the land sector often include it in a very unclear way. They haven't really specified how they will account for the land sector, or they differ widely in how they treat it. And some countries actually use removals from the land sector to offset industrial emissions, which can make it very difficult to actually see where a country is at with respect to its emissions reductions. So related to this, there's a lot of flexibility in how parties can report and account for their emissions and removals against their NDCs. There's no common accounting approach for the land sector. So, for example, the way that countries account for natural disturbances is not agreed. And the accounting rules that have been so far agreed only apply to the second NDC period. And for some parties, that only starts in 2030. And that means we'll have to wait for quite a long time before we have more clarity on how some parties will account for their removals. Then for tracking progress against the NDCs, parties can actually choose their own indicators. And this makes it very difficult to compare efforts in reducing emissions and enhancing removals. In terms of inventory reporting, which is important for tracking emissions and removals at the global level, there are big inconsistencies between parties, and this is often due to a lack of capacity within developing countries. This makes it really difficult for tracking carbon flows from supply chains that include a capacity-constrained developing country. So, for example, if you have a BECCS project where the bioenergy feedstocks are grown in a developing country which has a limited reporting capacity, it might be difficult to understand the overall life cycle emissions of that project. The rules for transfers of emission reductions and potentially removals between parties under the Paris Agreement market mechanisms have also not yet been agreed. And this means that there is a really high risk of double counting. So the same emissions reductions might be double counted by multiple parties or in multiple timeframes. And then most fundamentally, the flexibility inherent in NDCs can create perverse incentives for parties to distort the true level of mitigation ambition that they intend to deliver. This can happen, for example, through the creative selection of baselines or reference levels against which targets are set, or a party may choose to omit a sector or an activity that is set to increase its emissions. So they might just leave that out of their NDC, making their NDC look better or making it seem easier to meet. And this in turn makes tracking progress at the global level against net zero very difficult. And that's fundamental, because remember the importance of 2030 emissions levels for the amount of CDR that we will ultimately need. If we don't have clarity on the scale of mitigation that we're going to potentially achieve in the next decade, then it's very difficult to plan for the scale of carbon removal that we will need over the whole century. From a scientific perspective, there are also challenges, and these mostly relate to having access to information for monitoring carbon removals and tracking their use. That includes across supply chains and across national borders. Being able to track permanence over time is also really important, because a lot of removals might not last very long. They might not last forever. For example, if you have a natural disturbance, then removals that have been achieved through reforestation might be lost through a forest fire or a tropical cyclone, for example. There is also the critical challenge of enhancing understanding of and developing criteria for how to deploy carbon dioxide removal that is positive for sustainable development. This means that we need to take local needs and local contexts into account. So there are a lot of challenges that need to be addressed if we're going to deploy carbon dioxide removal at scale. But what needs to be addressed as a matter of priority? And who should address these priorities? I'll step through 5 priorities that we identified in our recent report and that we're currently in the process of updating and will be available very soon. First and most fundamentally, we need enhanced mitigation ambition from all parties. This should be in the form of new and updated NDCs, as well as long-term emissions reduction strategies aimed at mid-century. These need to be 1.5 degree consistent if we're to limit the amount of carbon dioxide removal to any level that could be achieved within sustainability constraints. We will also need to move towards a common understanding of net zero at the national level. So that means it should be economy-wide, should cover all gases, and it shouldn't be reliant on international offsetting, because otherwise it's very difficult to see where we're at and where we're going. We also need to encourage distinct targets for the land sector, recognising that biological flows are fundamentally different from fossil fuel flows. They're much more difficult to track, and they're much more difficult to ensure their permanence. So really ideally, we should keep these flows separate. Separate targets would also be really valuable for removals versus emissions reductions. This would emphasise that we need both emissions reductions and removals in order to give a clear picture of where we stand and to see if we're actually on track. The responsibility for enhanced ambition really lies with governments, as well as the private sector, but pressure could come from the UN Secretary General, the UNFCCC Secretariat, as well as civil society and the private sector at large. Second, we need improved inventory data and management systems so that we have a better and more complete picture of our emissions and removals. Improved data availability will really help the global community to better track progress towards global goals, as well as to track new carbon dioxide removal initiatives and their effectiveness, and to monitor geophysical feedback. Many entities have a role to play here, from parties to other UN agencies such as the International Maritime Organization, but also NGOs and intergovernmental organizations. Third, we really need robust accounting rules so that accounting loopholes and asymmetries don't permit the erosion of the nationally determined contributions that we already have, and that they don't allow for double counting. In the context of the market mechanisms, these rules will be really critical for ensuring that any transfers in the markets don't undermine the pledges that we already have in place. This is particularly important given that the NDCs currently take us to way above 1.5 degrees. One critical question is whether removals in the land sector will or should be transferable under the market mechanisms of the Paris Agreement. The land sector is so fraught with uncertainties and challenges, for example, in verifying that removals have taken place and ensuring that they are long-lived. And this means that permitting the transfer of land-based removals between countries to use towards their NDCs would be a very bad idea and would make things very difficult to track. Instead, we should look to support land-based removals with finance mechanisms such as results-based finance. This would ensure that land-based credits don't actually change hands. Governments really need to step up here in agreeing robust accounting rules, but it is likely that they'll need significant pressure from the UNFCCC Executive Secretary, but also from intergovernmental organisations and NGOs, so that they actually do the right job. Fourth, incentives are needed to facilitate a rollout of various CDR options at the scale required. We really need to look at what kind of incentives can get things off the ground quickly and can drive innovation, so that we can identify the CDR options that will be most effective. But of course, in creating these incentives, care really has to be taken to avoid the creation of perverse incentives, as these might end up undermining sustainable development objectives. And fifth and finally, we need to continue to better understand the role that carbon dioxide removal can play in sustainable development, and in particular to understand how it can be achieved without compromising sustainable development objectives. This means involving a range of stakeholders and looking at different local and regional contexts to understand which CDR options and which portfolios would work most effectively. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. Please check out our website for more information. You can find a lot more detail in our publication on large-scale carbon dioxide removal and governance. And watch out for our update, which will be coming out soon. Thank you very much.